Secretary Skinner, we've been anxiously awaiting. I was just having to move to fill in the gap, so your timing is perfect. We're just very delighted to have you back with us again today. It's almost exactly a year from the time that you visited with us at the NGA winter meeting, and having just taken office, and then of course you were with us in your home community of Chicago. Spoke to us at the NGA plenary session at that time. You've been a very busy man dealing with oil spills and earthquakes and labor management, but a matter of fact, the way in which you've handled all those has brought you into the focus of national news. Just recently, you've been in the National Journal, as well as a very in-depth article that appeared in the last Wednesday's Washington Post. And of course, during all that very busy activity, you've been working on transportation strategy for the nation, of which we're most anxiously awaiting to hear. But today we'd like to hear how that strategy will be a part of the next series of transportation program reauthorizations. Again, let me express our appreciation for you to joining us today, and we also thank you for bringing along some of your department's modal administrators. Brian Clymer, is Mr. Clymer going to be?
He was out. One of your governors waylaid him on the way in.
All right, so, we understand that. Let me see. Who's with the Urban Mass Transportation Administration, and of course we're very delighted to have the Admiral with us today of the Federal Aviation Administration. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today with us and also being available to answer questions. Secretary Skinner.
Thank you, Governor Orr. I apologize. One of your governors waylaid me on the way in too. So we had a very good discussion on an issue of interest. And you're next, Governor Thompson. Well, I am delighted to be here and discuss with you some of the things that are going on in the Department of Transportation, which I know are of key interest to you. First of all, let me say that I have with me, as you mentioned, Governor Orr, Brian Clymer, who will be here momentarily, who is the Urban Mass Transit Administrator. I also have with me, as you know, Admiral Busey, who's the FAA Administrator, and I think Gene McCormick, the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Highway Administration, is supposed to be here. I want to discuss with you briefly, and then we'll open it up for some questions, some of the things and the concepts that will be contained in the National Transportation Policy that has been approved by the Office of Management and Budget, is in the final throes of printing, and will be released to the nation in the first week of March. I think it's very important that we recognize, as we have in the past, that the National Governors Association will play a major role with us in the implementation of that policy. And already you have begun to explore some of the issues that we have identified and faced during that process. You yourself, Governor, with the support of NGA and the Federal Highway Administrator, held the workshop on alternative fuels, which presents some very interesting challenges to, as you know, to the revenue potential of the Federal Highway Program, and I compliment you. One of the things that it is pretty clear is that I think 1990s will be the decade of infrastructure, and as Governor Mickelson pointed out, infrastructure, jobs, and construction means infrastructure, investment, and investment means jobs. So I think we do understand that. And finally, let me thank the NGA not only for the outstanding report, which will be referred to in the National Transportation Policy, which you prepared last year on transportation infrastructure, chaired by your predecessor as chairman of this committee, but also to point out that what we're really facing here as we move into the next decade is whether our infrastructure and whether our highway, aviation, maritime, and mass transit system will remain competitive. This will be the decade of competition. Whether or not we will be able to compete in the world will be determined to some degree as to whether or not we have a competitive, efficient, and effective infrastructure. Obviously, the framework for our legislative agenda will be the framework laid out in the National Transportation Policy. And we have reauthorization going forward on Aviation Act this year, and we will have highway and surface transportation next year. All of that has already begun. And we met last week, for instance, with AASHTO, the National Highway Transportation officials, and shared with them some of our thoughts, but more importantly, got a great deal of input from your lead persons in surface transportation throughout the country. Let me talk about a couple of the themes that I think make sense, have been approved as administration policy, and will be announced shortly in greater depth. One is that we think that the federal efforts on transportation issues in the next reauthorization acts must focus on national significance issues. We must at the same time provide and will seek to provide through the authorization process greater flexibility to the states in meeting their needs. This will include recommendations relating to the loosening of restrictions on such things as toll roads, toll road finance, and private sector involvement. You will see this user theme concept go through the entire national transportation policy. If I might digress for a minute, I would point up to what many of you are already aware, that the user fee is playing a greater role in the financing of infrastructure throughout this country, and it is proving to be very effective. Several weeks ago, under the leadership of Governor Thompson of Illinois, the new toll highway in Illinois was opened up. It is fair to say that the projected use has been exceeded substantially already by that new user fee funded toll highway. And it points out the opportunities that are available in the urban areas for user-financed highways as a viable alternative to public systems. And I am encouraged by that, as well as the process that's going on in western part of, west of here a little bit, in the eastern part of Virginia, where some private sector developers are talking about expanding the toll road and operating it on a private sector basis. We see that all over the country. If we're going to have those kind of systems, we're going to have greater flexibility in the Surface Transportation Act, and we will be striving to give you that as we move forward. Finally, one of the things that we recognize that's been brought home time and again is that we have different needs and for different times, and that we have rural needs that also must be met. And the rural needs and the urban needs are substantially different, and the ability to build infrastructure within these two areas is substantially different, and we have to take advantage of that. I don't think there's any question that the #1 priority is placing resources on national significant projects, and at the same time making sure that the states have the opportunity to take the lead in many of these areas. For instance, the last numbers I saw were over 30 states have increased their user fees for transportation infrastructure in one way or another in the last several years. This is a concept that is going on all over this country. In North Carolina, Governor Martin, for instance, has an outstanding plan for a 4-lane interstate system backed up with a new North Carolina Highway Trust Fund program. Governors throughout the country are doing the same thing, and of course they're moving forward without relying totally on the federal government on new major infrastructure programs. The biggest one in the aviation area, of course, is the new Denver airport, which will be a multi-billion-dollar program that is being developed by the state of Colorado and the city of Denver with the full support of the congressional and Senate delegation from that state. And while the federal government will be a major player in that new airport, most of the financing will come from user fees generated at the state and local level. So I think you'll see that we feel very strongly that this is a concept that makes sense. And having been in Washington 14 months now, and having watched the needs that are placed upon the federal government for scarce resources, I believe transportation has the unique opportunity as an industry to develop funding concepts that, once protected, can serve as the source of investment for infrastructure that many other areas do not, and that we can no longer expect general revenues to be available in the levels they've been in the past to serve our nation's transportation infrastructure, given the critical needs, especially when you consider that many of these other areas do not have user fees and a user fee ability that can be used to generate this kind of support. So I think we feel strongly that user fees should be collected They should be levied, and obviously if you collect them and levy them at the state and local level, you have an ability to protect them from the federal deficit, and you also have the ability to control them, and that's very important to us. Brian Clymer has now been released by Governor Bayh and is here. And Brian can tell you that last year in our discretionary program in the Urban Mass Transit Administration, almost all of the grants that were made had a 50% or better local share. The days of the 20% local and 80% federal share are gone in discretionary programs, and that's because many of you have taken the leadership to deal with your nation's infrastructure problems and are coming up with substantial local shares. And we're finding that many projects are being funded throughout this country in places as far away as California and as close as Virginia that have a much greater local share than we've ever seen before. There's no question that this partnership is important, and that in an ideal world, one could argue that the federal government should enjoy a much greater role, but I suggest that we're really putting form over substance. If, in fact, user fees are going to be the concept for financing our nation's infrastructure, it appears to me that if there are good reasons for greater local control and management of these projects with less federal interference, which I believe as a matter of government policy makes sense, then we should also levy, to the degree we can, as many of these user fees at the state and local level, allowing the federal government to continue to play a major role to concentrate on those projects of national significance, and of course concentrate on maintaining the interstate highway system that we have and making sure that that valued asset continues to be in the top condition that it is now. One of the things that we are talking about in the National Transportation Policy, which is supported by the National Governors Association, of course, is the concept of intermodal or intermodalism. During the National Transportation Policy, we had Federal Highway Administrators, Urban Mass Transit Administrators, and Federal Aviation Administrators working right alongside with the Maritime Administrators and others in developing the policy. We have developed a synergy within the department between the administrations that has never been seen before. They continue to work on the implementation of that policy, and that will allow me to make sure that when a project comes on the drawing boards or nears approval status, that the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration and the administrator of the Urban Mass Transit Administration will be talking together about their respective roles and what role they can play in supporting this project, and they will have as their partner the Federal Highway Administrator. Because in many of the projects we're talking about today, the interconnection is extremely important, and we cannot allow these projects to be tied up in jurisdictional fights or disputes over what portion of the funding is coming from what administration. But because of this relationship, most of these disputes, I think, will be resolved prior to the time that they reach the approval stage. And finally, you will see in this year's budget, and you will see, I think, through the Bush administration, an increased investment in technology, in innovation. Our budget is substantially up this year over previous years. We have just begun a very major study on high-speed rail with the Corps of Engineers. We are increasing the emphasis and investment in the intelligent highway vehicle system process. And what our investment will be geared toward is improving the efficiency and the utilization of the current systems that we have. It is quite clear to us that technology offers substantial advantages on spreading out the usage on existing systems. In California, we are beginning the experiment on intelligent highway vehicle systems, which will allow us to actually demonstrate through a computer what the usage is on various alternative routes and which is the most desirable route, and then be able to basically tell the driver this particular route has a delay of 7 minutes versus the current route you're on now has a delay of 25 minutes, and if you get off at the next exit, go 2 blocks down and take this artery, you will find, based upon what is actually going on that system right now, that you will move 15 minutes faster. Now that concept will allow the driver to make the intelligent decision, which today they won't make because they don't know what's actually going on there. Many of you have seen who visited my office, the flow control computer that's in my office that allows us to model and actually monitor air traffic of all airplanes on active flight plans in the United States. That concept and that investment in technology is paying off, because that is being used today to maximize the utilization of our valued airspace. You will find that in our multi-billion-dollar investment in the NAS plan, which will equal as much as $15 billion within the next several years, we are developing technology that will allow us to efficiently use existing airspace, and that technology, I might add, will then be developed for export all over the world. We have and will have the best, most complete air traffic control system in the world when we're done with our multi-billion-dollar investment. That technology is already being looked at by countries all over the world as they seek to expand and modernize their air traffic control systems. And even though we face delays all over this country, our system is not only the safest, but is also the most efficient. And when we are done, it will be even more efficient. So that investment, as you know, in research and technology is going to pay off, not only for America, but for American businessmen. Finally, I think you will see that we have addressed the problem of the trust fund to some degree, not as great as some of you would like. There is not a subject that I hear more about than that, and I will save my response to the questions, which I know, if Wallace doesn't give me, Tommy will, that the President is committed to spending down the trust fund. The trust fund issue, as it relates to the surface transportation issues, is different for mass transit as compared to the highway system, and the Federal Aviation Trust Fund is different than the Surface Transportation Acts. If, in fact, for example, we were to operate the air traffic control system in this country, as well as make all of the capital expenditures that have been approved out of the trust fund, rather than relying on general revenues, we would deplete the Aviation Trust Fund quite quickly. This year, we're recovering a little over 60% of the cost of the system from the trust fund. Yet, 85% of the system is used by commercial business and private aircraft, and 15% by the military. So if, in fact, we're moving towards user fees, it appears to me to be logical that we have a cost of the system and a cost to the user be paid out of the user fund that's been generated. The Congress has disagreed with us to some degree, and it continues to rely on a combination of general revenues as well as trust fund revenues, and that makes the budget issues and the deficit problems very difficult to deal with. So I hope you will support us in moving the aviation system of this country to a totally user fee system, which will allow us to, not only now but in the future, ensure that the revenues that are generated by users go into the system directly. Otherwise, it gets very complicated. These are some of the concepts. I have read the very detailed analysis that your staff prepared for this meeting over the last several weeks, Governor Orr, and I'll assume that every member and every governor here has read it in detail, just as I did last night. And therefore, I will entertain questions given the remaining part of the time.
Oh, I know there are going to be many questions, and before we ask the governors to direct their questions to you, I want to, as chair, use this opportunity to remind the Secretary something that he already knows, but 18 states did increase their gas tax past year, and 11 of them have to a greater than a 20-cent per gallon tax. and of course coupled with the federal, and Nebraska happens to be a state that has the dubious distinction of being the highest gas tax in the nation. So we are indeed doing our part for user fees to support
I agree, Governor Orr,
infrastructure.
and I would only comment two. Number one, that opportunity exists now, and I've encouraged many of you to take it, and I'm glad that you have. And number two, if you look at other developed countries in the world, you will see that the percentage of the total cost in other countries of the world even exceeds by a substantial amount that exists in this country. So there may be even room for more growth.
Not for Nebraska, however. Maybe for the others, but we want to maintain
anyway.
our competitive position. So we've just about exhausted the resources that we have for user fees. But Governor Thompson of Illinois.
I'll observe first, Madam Chairman, that the Secretary is the most effective lobbyist in assisting governors to raise their gas tax. And I'll be glad to give you references of his ability to work with state legislatures when they're somewhat recalcitrant. The appearance of the U.S. DOT Secretary in the state capitol oftentimes works magic, as I know from experience. I don't have a question for the Secretary because I know my fellow governors are ready to pounce. I just have a comment that I want to bring to the attention of the committee, something that's gone unremarked on in the public journals. A few weeks ago, there were news stories that concerned a controversy, a supposed controversy within the administration on the administration of wetlands policy and a compromise that was reached with regard to wetlands policy, and most of the news stories focused on the impact of the policy on Alaska. What the stories did not say was that the original policy posed a grave threat to the ability of every state in this nation to construct highways in a rational manner and to preserve wetlands at the same time. And it was only through the active intervention of Secretary Skinner, supported by our DOT secretaries at the state level, and through the active intervention of Governor Sununu at the White House, which I think has been mischaracterized in the press, that we were able to retain any rational policy for building highways. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for that intervention and for the willingness to take the heat, and to thank Governor Sununu as well for preserving our abilities in that respect.
I might add, Governor Thompson, we heard from 40 some states concerning projects that they were concerned about had the MOU been implemented in its original way, and I think over 30 states either wrote me or the White House, either secretaries of transportation or governors, and I don't think that story has totally gotten out, so I thank you for bringing it up. Governor Goldschmidt knows more than anybody, because he had my job, that the balance of wetlands and the President's commitment to no net loss is quite clear, but we've got to do it in a rational way that allows you to build some of the major projects. In many of the areas that we're talking about require a degree of flexibility in the permit process. And I think with the changes which Administrator Riley, and Governor Sununu and I and others have agreed to, along with the Corps of Engineers, make sense. Do not compromise the no net loss wetlands policy, but at the same time give the Corps and EPA the flexibility to meet some of the project needs that you want. We had a list of some $20 billion plus in projects that might be in jeopardy as a result of that agreement in its original form, including some of the major projects that are going on in this country. So I thank you very much for your support. I hope that, as Governor Thompson points out, that as we go forward in developing the no net loss wetlands policy in its final form, you will be as vocal and as participatory as you were, because this is an issue that your state highway directors place on many of you at the very top of your list. And we've got to make sure that we come up with a sensible policy, and I think we're moving in that direction. Thank you, Governor, for reminding me of that.
Chairman.